Welcome to the Spiderforest Webcomic Podcast. I'm Mathieu Moyen. In this episode, fact and fiction. There's an old adage that you should write what you know, but what do you know? And how do you know what you know? First up, I have an interview with Tony Bourne, creator of the comic The 388th and the graphic novels Gen Egg and The Fed. Then our member Colby Purcell, creator of the comic Lintier, will join Sophie Pfrötzschner of the comic Soul's Journey, Robin Childs of Leylines, and Denise Randall of Gemutations Plague to talk more about world building and writing from experience. There's fact, there's fiction, and then there's everything in between. Stay with us. Hi, I'm Mathieu Moyen, and I produce a science fiction military comic called Six Commando. For a number of years now, I've kept up a correspondence with the graphic novelist Tony Bourne, whose own work has shared some similarities with my own. While Tony has been drawing comics for most of his life, he's probably best known for his two graphic novels, Gen Egg and The Fed. And although both draw heavily from his own life experience, Gen Egg, portions of which he is now serializing as the webcomic The 388th, draws particularly from his time in service with the United States Armed Forces. And we sat down recently to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I spent 10 years in the National Guard in New York and in California. I went from being enlisted, I went to OCS, and the last 6 years I was an officer. When I was a kid, I was always fascinated with the military, but I knew at no point I could have joined, especially my parents wanted me to go to college, So I found the National Guard because at the time the reserves didn't have any combat arms. So I went into the National Guard because I could have been tanker or infantry or whatever the hell I felt like. So I try to put some type of realism or some kind of real world stuff in there. I try to make equipment right. I try to make logistics right. But 388 is fun. It's different direction because it's like I'm trying to claim that it's military science fiction, but so far the whole storyline is pretty much straight military. There's going to be a major shift in that in coming months because I am introducing some other characters. So that's going to go in that direction and bring in the sci-fi aspect of it. It's to say I've been drawing a lot of robots recently.
The 388th does classify, strictly speaking, as military sci-fi, but it's also sort of timeless in the sense that it could be the 60s, or it could be the 80s, it could be Afghanistan, or it could be North America. But at the same time, it does feel very internally consistent, the way the characters are created, the way that the feeling of it is very consistent throughout, of sort of a small unit, a small group of people in a small section of a larger conflict. How did you go about creating that? I have to imagine that your military service informed that in an enormous amount. I mean, if you had 10 years in and you were both enlisted and an officer, that you had a broad experience of that.
Well, again, like I said, I was really fascinated with military in general. So one of the things you do as a military officer, you always try to keep up on your profession. So you study history, you study the latest journals and stuff that's coming out, and stuff coming down the pipeline. Like I'm amazed by the equipment and gear that's available now compared to when I was in. It's like science fiction. It's just like, oh my God, you got drones, you got, ability to look over a hill. All the stuff that's out there now that's commonplace didn't exist back in the 90s when I was running around as a young officer, and it's amazing. The world building part of it is directly from the first two Gen Egg books because the whole conflict is set up in that. I explained beforehand, and it's heavily influenced by the Cold War, which I served through, and what if, Some of the characters in the second Gen Egg book are riding around in a vehicle basically copied from a German half-track back in World War II. So I'm trying to blur the lines as far as who's on what, almost like an alternate universe in a way, because it's like I don't want to have it say, well, this is 2030. No, maybe it's 2090. Because I also found it, I noticed the fact a lot of science fiction hits a wall when you put a hard date on it. You put a date on it, and sooner or later that date gets passed or it comes within reach, and people are like, well, it doesn't really fit. So I always like better to have like a blurred line where this could be an alternate timeline, alternate universe, whatever you want to call it. So the 388 is pulling directly from those two books and that conflict, which already, in my head, I already have it well established. So that gives it a kind of concrete base, I guess, where to go from. So like one of the pages, Sergeant Hill's talking to the first sergeant, and they're having this whole big conversation. And I'm throwing little little factoids in there, like, these guys are working with a bigger government that's may not be a good guy, but whatever. And the enemy is a complete mystery other than that the fact that they're ruthless. I mean, even in the two books, I never really break down a lot of detail as far as the opposition. Because a lot of times soldiers are fighting based on the fact that that's the enemy, this is my side, and that's it. That's as simple, as basic as it gets to. You don't care about the guy's philosophy on the other side. You're just trying to stop him or kill him. And that's basically what I'm trying to capture in some of the storyline.
There is a lot of feeling of a larger world that is connected but not necessarily involved directly in the lives of your characters, though. That is another part that I found very interesting. There's a portion of the early part of the 388th that just passed where your men were in the field, they take fire, and they are relieved and sent back for R&R after combat. And there's references to the Navy having set something up. So there's a Navy. And you have references to military intelligence. So there's an MI branch. But it's all done in a way that sort of assumes it, but at the same time explains it within the flow of the story.
It definitely comes back from experience, because there's times you're serving and you have to rely, the whole system, military works basically on faith, where you believe that somebody you never met is going to do their job to their best ability to help you out. For example, you could be waiting on the side of a hill for a chopper to come in. You don't know if the chopper's coming. You don't know, you can set up all the plans you want, and your higher command makes all the motors and things move as far as coordinating stuff, but you don't know that the pilot and that crew are trying their best to get there because they know they have to get there a certain time period. Or, it could be something as simple as rations getting there on time, or bullets getting there on time. Conflicts are won and lost. People lose their lives or are saved based on the actions of people they never met, getting shit to them at a certain time period. And there's times you just have to total trust that the whole system is going to work, because at a certain point, you've done everything you can to make it happen. And, you hope that somebody else is doing the right thing at the right time.
That really does show up in the 388th, though, because the characters respond as though they have that kind of belief. And that works really well into the world building that you do, I think, because the characters are making that same assumption. But it also you've also structured the world in such a way that even people who don't have that same experience understand that that's the assumption that people are making. That's a mistake, I think, that gets made an awful lot in military comics. To people who don't understand that it's about other people doing their job, it feels like magic, Yeah,
I'm glad that comes across, because just again, sometimes you create stuff and you're not sure if the reader's going to get it, or or whoever's looking at it is going to understand what you're doing. Because again, I always find that a lot of times you create stuff, you're standing in the middle of a forest. You can't really, you're looking at all the details and I'm going to do this, and you might be missing something bigger.
Well, it's also another part that I'd like to draw attention to and really get your opinion on. First of all, that you're relying on previous works as a source material for this particular segment of it, but also you have a world that you don't really see that makes the world that you do see function.
When I was flip-flopping back and forth when I first drew out, I got to find the original pages, the first Gen Egg book, where I tried to explain this whole giant world that's going on, this conflict between these two superpowers and what leads to the war starting. Trying to do that in a graphic novel tradition was blowing my mind, because it was like you're trying to cram this gigantic world into 6 panels per page, and you're like, okay, how the hell do I do this? And I think that's probably why it started morphing, because I got to look at some of the earlier stuff I did and see how I pulled it off or didn't pull it off, because I know there was a lot of explanation, and I'm always trying to find a new way of doing information dumps, because I hate when sometimes you say you watch a movie and they just throw this explanation. Oh, EMP. What's EMP? And the guy sits there and gives you a textbook version of what an EMP is. Yeah, I understand how it's necessary, because the average person may not know what it is, but it could be done more subtly or crafty than a lot of times people do it. I try to figure out what is the most essential thing to put out there, and what do I just put out there and let people figure it out. In the Fed, there's times that I purposely didn't explain stuff and just let you figure out as a reader. And I did that purposely because I didn't want to sit there and have a whole big info dump and see this is how they go from point A to point B. By the second time you see it happen, you realize what's going on. And that, to me, is just an easier way of doing it. Plus, it's more, in some way, I think, streamlined. So that way you can concentrate on just getting your mind blown. I want you to go, oh, shit, what is this? What is he doing here? That's what I want to have happen, As far as world building, I really think if you present a good way of showing Joe Blow going from A to B, or he's dealing with this or this, you will figure it out. Because I think every time you put a word balloon or whatever you put in there, it's got to be vital, or it has to at least help you continue reading.
You have in hand all of the things that you know and that all of the things that you want people to know. But pacing out how you reveal that is something that takes a great deal of skill, and also I think a great deal of restraint as an artist.
It does play a few, because in the Fed I had an idea. So I'm working this whole story to try to get to this one point, this one reveal. So I have this whole conflict going on, and you got introduced this new character, say page 15 or page 20 of the story, and sooner or later he comes into play in the storyline, and I wanted this big reveal. And again, like you said, sometimes the pacing. I remember creating the book, and you're going through proofing, you're going back, you're looking at it, and realizing, something, I need 2 more pages in here. I want this to get to this point, so I have to drag it out, or I have to add this because this is going to make the reveal better. And that's basically what sometimes happens. Happened in 388. Some of the pages I actually noted that some were A's or B's, like page 21, whatever, A or B, because I had to put it in there because I wanted the storyline to make more sense. That's after going back and looking at it and looking at what I wrote. Because again, the writing for the story is more current. That's more stuff from the last 6 or 8 months opposed to some of the artwork. So sometimes I have to put in adding pages just to make things make more sense. In the Fed book, the third one, I remember definitely doing that. Again, this thing was 130 pages. So at a certain point, you're like, wait a minute, did I explain this enough? Or maybe I have never had the point where I had to pull a page because it's too much. I always end up adding something because I think the pacing needs the story to develop more, or this has to build more. So that's basically what happens. I think in the Fed, I actually ended adding like 2 or 3 pages just to flesh out the reveal.
My name is Colby Purcell. I'm the creator of Lint, and with me I have Sophie from Soul's Journey. Hello, Sophie.
Hello.
And I have Robin Childs from Leylines.
Greetings and salutations.
And I have Denise Randall, or Darwin. She has 2 comics, The Only Half Saga and Gemutation Plague.
Hello.
First, let's start out with, I'd like to hear from each of you as far as how much world building you have done. So why don't we start with Sophie?
Well, my comic is set in a fictional world, but it's more of a low-key fantasy one. It's mostly based on our world, but has some aspects that are different and that need to be introduced. Since the world is sort of based on the 18th century in our world, so to speak, there's a lot of what did people wear, what was their mindset back then, and right now I'm researching medical treatment. I've got a scene coming up in 2 chapters, and I got curious and started researching how they treated wounds back then.
And the 18th century medical treatment is so different from what we have now. I would imagine that would be a lot of research.
Yeah, it is. I mean, a lot of what we do nowadays was founded back then, but the 19th century had more influence on what we do now.
Robin, how about you?
My world takes place in a fabricated environment, so I've made my own culture and history and geography and language and so many things. But it's not as complete as it looks from the outside, because a lot of people are like, oh my god, you must have thought of every single little detail. And the magic trick is that I have only felt out the foundations of the world and kind of the basics of how it works together. So I will go through booms and busts of developing it. So I'll get to a point where I suddenly need to research something because I have a gap in what I've developed. So then I'll go and just figure out how that one thing works. Like, how does science, what scientific technology level are we at? Or it might be even more specific. It might be, what kind of gun manufacturer is this world capable of at this time and why? It sort of ping-pongs back and forth as to how much is really developed at any one time, but it all looks very consistent from the outside.
Do you find that you have to keep a lot of notes for that?
I'm up to 3 binders full at this point. Going on 4? Maybe I am at 4. I've lost track. Yes, is the short answer to your question.
But it's all fun, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's an interesting way to kind of pull from sort of scenarios, setting up an idea of if this is true, if my characters live in a world in which people can actually talk to their gods, what impact does that have on culture, on science? What belief systems do people have? Can you be an atheist in a world where gods talk to people? It creates a lot of really interesting questions that lead to building out the world in different ways.
And you get to kind of build your own internal logic with that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And, fudge factor too. It's like, I left this vague on purpose so I can change my mind later. And no one has to know because it's my world.
And then how about you, Darwin? Tell us a little bit about your worlds, and are they related? First off, the two comics that you have, are they in the same universe?
They originally started out as separate universes with separate world building and history. I managed to end up tying them all together, not necessarily in the comics themselves, but in the novels they're based on. So in, say, the Only Half Saga, one of the early books actually had Tiger Shark as a character, as like a cameo appearance. So they are tied now. They weren't always.
And so how do you do your world building? What is your mode?
Well, I tend to, like say with Plague. Plague started out as a way for me to tie two separate sets of characters together and use them in the same story. So technically the brothers Martin, Tom and Steve, they started out in a completely separate set of stories. And that was all based on, could a person who is a cyborg live a normal life? So I did a lot of research on biomechanical and integration and those sorts of things with those two characters. And Tiger Shark came about because, well, I had a dream about him one time. And so I had to do a lot of world building to talk about a flooded area and how he would fit into that and why there were mutants in this world and those sorts of things. So I've done a lot of back building on that. In the Only Half Saga, there is a drive in me to explain vampires in a scientific way that makes sense. And so I went back and I kind of thought about, why would they burn in the sunlight? Why do they need to have blood? Are they an undead or are they something else? So I had to consider all of these different things when I was doing that world building.
Each of you have said, as far as the way that you build your worlds, it's like you're all asking these questions and using your internal logic that you're building to answer them. And that seems to work. So, any of you that feel like you want to just kind of jump out and talk more about this, if you have a fictional world, how important is it to have elements of realism in it?
I think it's vital because it's so easy to get lost and to lose a sense of connectedness with fantasy stories. If they don't have their own internal logic, if they don't feel real as places, I think the reader can get really easily disconnected from them because it doesn't feel true anymore. So I think in many ways it's more important for someone writing a fantasy story to really do a lot of research and read widely, read history and science and do their best to understand as much as possible about the world so that they can really draw the reader into the place they're trying to make.
I have to say I agree with that. When I was growing up, I loved vampire stories, always did. But one of the things I could never understand is how you could have something that was technically dead be alive. And so I think that's what drove me to research scientific ways a vampire could be considered a real entity in a story. And so I did a lot of making sure that the science behind it was actually viable and believable. And so I agree with Robin in that it helps you ground out the story and make sure that people don't have to suspend their disbelief in huge ways.
Yeah, I agree too. Facts are necessary for somebody to actually believe that something fantastical can happen. In order to get them to believe that, you need to feed them something that they know is true first.
So if you were going to talk about writing what since they always say when you're writing, write what you know. And I found that I have the most success when I'm writing, if I'm writing something that feels like something that I do know. But none of us have ever lived in a fantasy world. So how do you apply that concept to creating a fantasy world? How do you feel like you're writing what you know, even if it's about these people who are living lives that have magic or they're different strange creatures? How do you get that to work?
I think a vital component there are emotions. What does it feel like to use magic, for example? Does it drain you? Are you exhilarated? Is there a lot of adrenaline being produced? What does it feel like? And then you just need to find a way to portray it. I mean, in novels, for example, you could describe all this stuff, and in comics, you need to find a way to do it visually so that the character looks like they're experiencing something that is relatable in some way.
I would agree with the write what you emotionally know. Even if you're making something that's fantastical, you can still put yourself into that place and find the human core behind it. In my own story, I have a character called my secret main character, Misha. Her whole story is something that I emotionally can relate to very strongly, but people don't see it at first glance. So her character, she's been told her whole life that what everybody else wants is more important than what she personally wants. And even though she has an amazing power, which is to make her dreams into real physical realities, she never uses that power unless she wants to make a world to escape into. So she's sort of escaping from her life into fantasy, which I'm a fantasy writer, and I came from a family that didn't support arts. I escaped in my life into that. Her fantastical, magical power is something that I personally can relate to. It's just metaphorical rather than literal, and that gives it a human core. So as she grows and as she starts to realize that her decisions matter in the real world, her choices and desires matter in the real world, she starts to realize her own dreams and changes her real situation. The same way that I got out of that family environment, left behind what I was expected to do by that family environment, and started to pursue artwork, which is what my passion was. So people don't see that real life connection because it's couched in that metaphor, in that fantasy, but it is still there, and it gives that character weight and richness and a point for people to connect with personally.
I've used personal experiences many times to help make a character deeper. I remember the death of my grandmother. I remember using the emotions that I felt to help flesh out how Cabal felt when his first wife was lost. So I've used a lot of personal experiences in my own life to make a realistic reaction for a character when they go through a specific situation.
I think there's also write what you know. People so often go, well, that means that all I can do is just write what it is to be a, in my case, it'd be a cis white woman, like whatever. I guess there's nothing else I can do with my writing. But if you don't know something, research it to the point where you know it really well. It doesn't say write what you know right now and you're not allowed to learn anything ever. Learning is a key part, and researching is a key part to writing what you know. It's a challenge more than a limitation.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that too.
I really liked, Robin, what you brought up about metaphors, because some of the most successful fantasy stories are based in metaphor. Really what they are is metaphors for things in the real world. If we think of something as far-flung as Star Wars, which no one has ever lived that life. However, there are parts of Star Wars, the most successful parts are really the ones that we feel like we can relate to. The emotional moments and the things that bring out the feelings in ourselves of, I know what this feels like, I felt this before, or I felt something similar to this before. And I think that fantasy has a unique ability to bring out these emotions, and at the same time, fantasy is free to be released from the real world. So you don't have, the things that sometimes tend to drag us down in the real world, like politics or, things that really drag things down, and we can get to the heart of matters sometimes with fantasy just through using these metaphors.
Yes, we can isolate these emotions and just channel them through the story.
So what are some things that you do to go about grounding your fictional fantasy story in order to make it more believable? What are some things that maybe you could give advice, any of you, to someone who is maybe writing their first story on how to make their fantasy world a more believable place?
Well, first thing I would do is always consult friends and tell them what this world or the story is about and see if they catch on. And if they understand it, then there's a good chance that either you explained it very well and things are consistent, or maybe they're just pretending to know what you said. But yes, talking to others and explaining the world can definitely help to make sure everything stays consistent. Most time it's others that actually catch on to, let's say, errors or mistakes within the consistency of a world. I mean, there is a reason why there are so many videos about something like that on YouTube. So yeah, my advice definitely is talk to other people and see how they react.
Which is that is a wonderful thing. I have two daughters who also make comics, and we just sit there and we talk and talk and talk about our stuff. And that does help. It really helps to have that person to bounce your ideas off of. And sometimes you figure out in the process of talking about your ideas, wait a second, I need to fix this, or wait a second, just through the process of talking about it.
Yes, and you also discover things that you haven't really thought about yet. When you mentioned that this thing is not quite fleshed out yet, and the other person may have an idea to actually connect it and ground it within the story, so it definitely helps to talk ideas through.
I've always found that beta readers and people to bounce ideas off of is like invaluable. Friends, people across the internet, that sort of thing, just to make sure that things do make sense. I agree with what Sophie said. One of the things I used to love about Saturday mornings is I and 3 friends would get together and talk about our stories, and then we'd be like, well, that doesn't quite make sense, so what do you think about changing it to something like this? Definitely helped refine the writing style that I have today.
For me, I like to work in structures. I'm a very structure-oriented person. So I like to make a grid. And in that grid is what, who, where, and when. And what is things like, is there magic? Is there technology? Is there, what kinds of things give people power in this world? What gives them influence in this world? Who are the key figures that exist in this environment? Who is influencing things? Who's ruling or managing or controlling or, that kind of thing? Where is physical location, its geography, its resources? If someone's living in the middle of an ice planet, it's going to be a very different world, and they're going to have a lot of different things at their disposal than if they're living in the middle of a jungle. And when is a rough historic timeline so that things are connected to each other? Because I feel like if you can kind of get that grid, just the basic idea of it, and I'm not talking details, I'm talking like broad swaths. You can kind of just go in a circle around that grid because each one of them will influence the other and give you more ideas. And I like to go around maybe once or twice and then stop and then start writing my story. Because one thing that world building can become is a distraction tactic where we get to avoid doing our stories because, well, I'm doing work because I'm doing all this cool world building. And I've known people that have spent years and years and years building their worlds to the tiniest detail in the idea that, oh yeah, one day I'm going to write a story, but they never do because they're not willing to let themselves take that first step. So I like to kind of have an automatic cutoff in how I do things so that I don't fall prey to that self-sabotage pattern. So having that grid and going around just a couple times, if I've gone around 3 times, it's time to stop and get back to writing.
I have a friend who actually falls into that very same trap. She actually has been working on the same novel now for almost 20 years that I've known her and has yet to finish it. And I know exactly what Robin's talking about that. She's so into the research, so into the world building, wants it to be actually like perfect. And unfortunately, because she's doing that, she keeps going back and scrapping it and starting over every single time. And so that is a very easy trap to get into. I keep telling her, just get it written and worry about the rest later.
It's something I work on with clients a lot. I'm a developmental editor for people who write novels and comics and all other sorts of things. And one of the downsides that people don't realize is that if we put in so much time and energy into world building, we can't see it from the outside. So often we will feel the desire to include all this cool research and effort we did, and the reader either does not have the context to care or isn't engaged in the world yet or engaged in the characters. And all that world building that seemed so great to us actually gets in the way of people engaging with the narrative. So a lot of what I do is just helping people realize either, okay, you haven't given us enough context and we need to know more, or that is way too much info and it's not necessary, and pare it down. And that's sort of the double-edged sword of world building, is you have to do it to make it feel real, but if you do too much, you lose the narrative.
Yeah, you need all this information for yourself, but telling the reader everything about it will definitely be like an avalanche of information that they just try to shovel out of and never come back. And the more information you give them, the more it seems like this is important stuff that they need to remember at some point in the story, because that's usually how stories are constructed. You get a piece of information and it will become or should become important later on. So the more information you give them, the less likely are they to actually stick, because it's just too much that they seem to have to remember.
So would you say that there's any kind of a litmus test that we could go by that is too much world building, or that you've done enough world building? Are there any signs? Because I'm thinking too little world building, I would say, would be something like certain TV shows that they start out very mysterious and then it turns out they don't have answers to the questions that they posed at the beginning of the series. If you guys know what I'm talking about, I would say Once Upon a Time is an example of this, where their world has no logic within it. It's always breaking its own logic. So it seems like almost as if they didn't do enough world building at the beginning. But on the other hand, you can do too much and you get stuck for decades building this world before you even get started.
We all have complained about those stories that we see that have the first chapter is all about this walls of text of world building, and I think that kills a lot of people's interest because it's just too much all at once and it doesn't come out organically for the story. So that would be my kind of like litmus test. Just make sure it's not going to be one of those where you have to explain in huge amounts of expository about what exactly needs to happen before they can understand the story.
I think there's an element of lived-in world building where it should impact how characters behave and what they do, but you don't actually need the expository character, which a lot of people have started to crutch on for context. And I think often it's not as necessary as people think it is. And this was really highlighted to me when I was watching Aliens for the first time, the original Aliens. And it's basically truckers in space is the start of the beginning. And I was sitting there waiting for the exposition character to pop in and ask a question about why they were doing what they were doing, and the captain would then, the rookie character, and then the captain would then explain what they were doing, and it never happened. And I realized that it wasn't necessary to happen, because instead they had people just going about their daily lives and complaining about wages and complaining about things that you would normally complain about if you were a space trucker. It's not necessary to lay out in detail, oh, this is the history of why it happens and this is why we do it. What matters is that you know how something would impact a person's day-to-day lifestyle, thoughts, mannerisms, just how they go about what's normal for them. If you know what's normal for that character and you can just show the audience, they'll fill in the blanks themselves based on how your character acts.
I would agree with Robin that you should just establish what is normal, and then if something tends from that, readers will catch on. They're not stupid.
Sometimes it's more interesting when you're reading a story and it has that initial grounding in reality, like the truckers in space, and everything's not explained. For example, some stories that are maybe post-apocalyptic, but they never explain how it became post-apocalyptic. You're just in this situation, and it actually doesn't matter how you got to that point. It's about the story that's happening right now. But at the same time, you know that with the best stories, you know that the people behind it or the person behind it has done the world building to know how the world works, even if they don't give you a wall of text explaining how the world works.
Yeah, I think that's key. Paring it down to the bare minimum relevance is, I think, when you're writing the story is what's important to think about is what is the bare minimum amount of information that people need to understand this situation right here, right now. On my first webcomic, when I was still learning about this, I had several walls of text just interspersed in things because it was so important to me that I explain how, angel hunting worked. Looking back on it, my husband was going through stuff because he was rescanning it because I had a terrible scanner when I'd done it originally. And he said, do you want me to even bother scanning this page? Because if you changed one line of dialogue on the next page and you took this one out, nothing would change. And that was such a huge wake-up call to me to realize, oh, none of this was actually relevant to the story. And if I had just pared down to what mattered, I wouldn't have needed any of that. So I think that's key is what's relevant right now. Don't worry about the rest of it.
I had the same problem when I first started webcomics. I had to explain what was in everybody's heads all the time to try and help build the world and the characters. And I came to find as I got more experience that that was just too heavy-handed. It didn't make a lot of sense for me to do that. So I really, when I went back and I edited those pages, I pared out a lot of that head hopping, telling everybody what everybody thinks at every given time. And I just felt that that was way better to tell a story and do the world building in general.
What a wonderful discussion. I feel like I'm learning here from you guys. So just to kind of wrap it up, what would you say is an example of how you have grounded your fictional world in reality to give it more solid foundations? It can be a really specific example or it can be general, but anything that you have done to kind of give your fictional world that feeling that this is real, this has logic, and so that people can get lost in it and keep that suspension of disbelief.
The biggest one that I have is I said earlier that I wanted to have believable, scientifically grounded vampires in my story. And so I went and did things like they are not an undead creature. They're like a basis of parallel evolution. I was actually in a college course when I was getting my bachelor's degree, and the lady who was teaching it was an elephant trainer. And she talked about parallel evolution and how Asian and African elephants are actually not the same kind of animal. They are parallel evolution and they cannot interbreed because of that. So I got that idea stuck in my head and I was like, I have to use that for this vampire story. So what it is that way back in their history, humans and vampires evolved along a parallel evolution. And so they are actually just another creature on the earth. They're not undead. They don't get risen from the grave and that sort of thing. So I thought that was a really good way to make my vampire characters more believable.
I love that. And you don't put it an entire page. You don't write that out on an entire page as an info dump either.
No, that's a background piece of information. And it's honestly, I don't think I've ever really touched on it in the comic itself, except for the fact that vampires and humans on occasion can interbreed because Cabal is a half vampire. So the genetic evolution finally came to a point where they were close enough together that crossbreeding could happen. And that's why Cabal came to be.
For me, a recent example is character design, where I've had this god character who is kind of a mixture of a human and a snake. And when I sat down to actually flesh out the design, my first sketches just looked so off and so generic. And I thought, I really need to put in more effort here to make this look real, look grounded. So I did research on snakes and skulls and muscle and how human skulls look and how snake skulls looked and muscle groups for those two different animals, and found a way to kind of combine visually the skull structure of a human being and a snake. So the result is this really intensely creepy looking combination, but it also looks like something that you could see on a creature somewhere. So I think like for monster design, if someone's doing a fantasy story that involves monsters, it's really vital to think about how that entity would work and function and compare it to other animals that work and function. And to think about the environments that they exist in, how they interact with those environments. One tip that I once heard from someone is to think about how a creature would navigate a door, how they would navigate that in their natural environment and out of it. So if it's a creature that maybe lives underwater, how would they navigate a doorway if it was an underwater doorway versus how would they attempt to do it on land, and how that would change the distribution of weight and the way that the motion would move through those muscle groups, and what would function well versus not at all in a different environment. Again, it's not something where I'm going to sit you down and say, okay, now I'm going to explain to you the biology of this god. But you can see it and react to it, and part of your brain will go, that looks right, even though that looks wrong.
Does anybody have anything else that you want to add about world building? Anything else that occurred to you while we were having this discussion that you may want to throw out? Say there's someone who's just getting started, wants to create this world, wants to make a webcomic. Where would you tell someone to start?
I would say start writing, just start making your story, and give yourself wiggle room with your world building. Don't feel the need to nail everything down, but keep in mind what you have already done and stay consistent to that. So if you paint in broad strokes, then you can later go back and say, okay, here are the details. I mean, like Darwin, you had a great example with the broad stroke was the different paths of evolution. But the more specific stroke was, well, okay, but now they've evolved to the point where some interbreeding can happen. So a broad stroke that dials down into something that's specific and unique. So that's the point where you can kind of expand on what you're doing, but you don't have to feel like you're totally bound. Because if we do every little detail, inevitably the story will change and what we want to say will change, because we as people will grow as we write, and comics take a long time. So chances are very good that your worldview and your understanding of things and the story that you want to talk about will change as you do your comic. And if you've left yourself wiggle room, you're not going to be like, God, what was I thinking when I wrote this? You'll be able to go, okay, if I just look at it differently, or maybe just tell the audience, well, you didn't know the whole story yet because neither did I. You don't need to know that part, but the new piece of information that changes everything is blah. And if you do that in a consistent way that still feels true emotionally to everything else, people will go, wow, you must have everything planned out. And you can just nod and say, yes, I do. Yes, it's me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Just last week, the remaining chapters of Search Journey got a complete overhaul and so many things changed. And it was only possible because I painted in these broad strokes that Robin was telling about. It definitely helps to have a rough idea of what you want to have and just fill in the details as you go, but keep it consistent. And there I definitely want to highlight talking to people about it to make sure it really makes sense and it's not just in your head.
I find that sometimes it's important to review what you've already done to make sure that you don't have any inconsistencies, because sometimes we forget some of the details that we have in the beginning of the story. And so how often do you find yourself reviewing what you've done in order to make sure that you don't forget parts?
All the time.
All the time.
All the time.
Yes.
Pretty much any time I sit down to do a new chapter, one of the first things I do is reread the old chapters, just to see if there's anything in there that went unaddressed or that I need to keep in mind, just to, again, to keep it consistent and to flesh out things that need to be developed. Because often I'll think that I have explained something, and then I'll go back and go, oh, no, I have totally not brought that up at all. It's funny, Sophie, you were talking about having to go back and completely overhaul everything. I recently did that exact same thing, and one of the things that I did was I was like, okay, I have these ideas that I thought at the beginning would it be so smart to drag out for all, like, God knows how long I'm going to be doing this chapters. But what I realized was the readership had already forgotten most of those things. And in fact, some of those things I had forgotten. And so I made a list of things that I wanted to resolve within 1 to 2 chapters. And I've just been going down that list. And so I'm in chapter 13 of my story, and for the first time in chapter 13 will I use the word Leylines, which is my title. At no point did I bring in my title into my story until it's now like 6 years in, and I'm looking back at that and going, yeah, I would do things differently if I were to go back and do this again, knowing what I know now. Some changes.
Well, once again, that's all the time we have for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer is Christina Major, and Eva is our showrunner and our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thanks for your support, and don't forget that you can go to spiderforest.com and read all of our comics for free. Plus, you can join the discussion on our forums, interact with our creators, and more, all at spiderforest.com. And you, yes, you, can help us make our very next podcast. How? By going to spiderforest.com and clicking on support to make a donation. Your financial support makes our work possible, so thank you very much for helping us out. I'd like to thank our special guest for this episode, Tony Bourne. You can read his comic, The 388th, at the388th.wordpress.com. You can also find his graphic novels, Gen Egg and The Fed, Volumes 1, 2, and 3, on Amazon.com. I'd also like to thank Colby Purcell for bringing us this episode's discussion, as well as our members who participated, Sophie Pfrötzschner, Robin Childs, and Denise Randall. Colby Purcell produces the comic Lintier. You can read it at lintier.webcomic.ws. Sophie Pfrötzschner produces the comic Soul's Journey. You can read it at soulsjourney.garidianchronicles.com. Robin Childs produces the comic Leylines. You can read it at leylinescomic.com. And Denise Randall produces the comic Gemutations Plague. You can read it at gemutations.spiderforest.com. And Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. And I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Mathieu Moyen. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
What Robin was saying about going back and rereading all the time, I thought I was weird because I was going back and rereading all my stuff all the time.
Oh, you
and it's
have
good to hear that
right?
I'm not the only creator who does that.
Nope.
It's certainly not, no.
I mean, most of the time I'm cringing going, God, what was wrong with me? But yes, I am rereading it.
I get that one. Yeah, I definitely feel that often.